The millionaire fires his driver for stealing a sandwich. But when he follows him home, what he finds inside that apartment makes him break down and weep like a child. Hello, friends. Welcome to today's story. Before we go any further, please like this video and hit subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Are you in Atlanta, Houston, maybe London or Canada? We genuinely want to know. Now let's get into it. It had been an ordinary Tuesday at the Smith estate. The kind of morning that arrives before you're ready for it. Still dark outside. The sky a deep, bruised blue that couldn't quite decide whether to become dawn or stay the night. The trees along the driveway stood perfectly still. The iron gate at the entrance had not yet buzzed open for the day. But Miles Copper was already moving. He was 67 years old. A tall man, though the years had borrowed a little from his posture the way they tend to do. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with large hands that had always looked more like a carpenter's than a chauffeur's. His face was the kind of face that had been handsome once and had simply aged into something more honest. Deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that was still strong, a mouth that didn't waste itself on unnecessary words. He had driven for Dewey Smith for 6 years, and in those 6 years, Miles had learned one very important truth about working for powerful men. The best driver is the one they forget is there. So he made himself forgettable. Every morning, he arrived before the sun. He pulled the car around to the east side of the estate where the light was softest and waited. He never honked, never knocked. He straightened his uniform cap in the rearview mirror, checked that his white gloves were folded neat on the dash, and he waited in silence. The way a man waits when he has made peace with being invisible. But that particular morning had been harder than most. He had woken at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm, the same way he'd been waking for the past 4 months. He lay still in the dark of his apartment and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound his own body was making. A low, dull pressure behind his sternum. Not pain exactly. Something duller than pain. Something patient. He pressed 2 fingers to his chest the way the doctor had shown him and counted. Then he got up. Because lying there counting didn't change anything. The bathroom mirror in Miles's apartment was small and spotted at the corners where the silver backing had begun to peel away. He stood in front of it for a moment and looked at himself honestly, something he'd learned not to do too often. The skin beneath his eyes had gone the color of old newsprint. His collar, when he buttoned it, sat looser than it used to around his neck. He had lost weight again. He hadn't weighed himself since October because the number had stopped telling him anything useful. He reached into the medicine cabinet and counted out his morning pills into his palm. 4 of them. Small and white and expensive. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at the small amber bottle that was already more than half empty, and did the quiet arithmetic that had become the daily prayer of his mornings. 17 pills left. 11 days. Refill costs $240. He closed his hand around the pills and swallowed them dry. Miles Copper had driven vehicles for 41 years. He had driven school buses in his 20s, delivery trucks in his 30s, and executive cars since he was 44. He had never once been late to a pickup. He had never once complained about the hours. He had driven through blizzards and heat waves, and one memorable evening during a Category 2 warning when every other driver in the city had called in, and he had simply put on his hat and gone. Work was not something Miles did. It was what Miles was. He had no children. His wife Evelyn had passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 9 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He had sat by her bed every night of those 9 weeks, held her hand, and then he had stood up on the morning of her funeral, put on the black suit that still hung in the back of his closet, and he had gone back to work the very next Monday. Because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still was something Miles Copper did not know how to survive. The cardiologist had told him 6 months ago what was happening inside his chest. She had been kind about it, in the way that doctors are when they have practiced being kind for a very long time. She had used words like progressive and management and reduced activity. She had told him he should not be working long hours. She had told him that stress placed additional burden on a heart that was already, she paused, chose her word carefully, compromised. Miles had listened. He had nodded. He had thanked her for her time. And then he had driven back to the Smith estate and done a 12-hour shift without mentioning any of it to anyone. Because who was he going to tell? And what exactly was telling going to fix? He pulled his uniform cap down over his silver hair, picked up the small Ziploc bag from the kitchen counter, the sandwich he had packed the night before, the one he'd been saving since yesterday because his stomach had been too unsettled in the evening to eat it. And he tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket. For later, he told himself. He would eat it on the way back from the afternoon run. He would sit in the parking structure and eat his sandwich in the quiet, and that would be a fine enough lunch for a Tuesday. He took the stairs down slowly, one hand on the railing, the way he always did now. He did not know as he walked out into the pale gray morning and climbed into the car that he would not be driving it home again. He did not know that in less than 4 hours, a man who had never once thought to ask his name would look at a security camera clip and decide in under 60 seconds that 6 years of silent loyalty amounted to nothing at all. Miles Copper started the engine. He pulled out of the lot. He drove toward the estate, the way he had driven 1,412 times before. The sky finally was beginning to decide it was morning. The Smith estate came alive the same way every morning, not gradually, but all at once, like a switch being thrown in a large and expensive machine. At precisely 7:15, the kitchen staff arrived. At 7:30, the housekeeper unlocked the east wing. At 7:45, the personal chef, a compact, serious man named Gerald, who had trained in Lion and never let anyone forget it, began preparing Dewey Smith's breakfast. And at 8 o'clock, Dewey Smith descended the main staircase in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, sat down at the head of a table that could seat 14 and ate alone. Miles had the car idling at the front by 7:55. He always did. He never went inside for breakfast. There was no standing invitation, and he had never expected one. He sat behind the wheel with the engine running soft and the heat on low, and he waited, the way he had waited 1,412 mornings before this one. Sometimes Gerald would send out a coffee through the side entrance with one of the kitchen assistants, a small gesture that Miles had always accepted without comment and been quietly grateful for. But that had been before the new assistant started, and the new assistant didn't know about the coffee, and Miles hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't eaten this morning. He'd meant to. He had the sandwich in his jacket pocket, the one he had carefully packed the night before. But his stomach had been doing the thing it sometimes did now, a low, rolling unease that made the idea of food feel like a negotiation he wasn't ready to have. He'd decided to wait. He would eat it later, on the way back from the airport run. He would eat it, and that would be fine. At 8:03, the front door opened and Dewey Smith walked out. Miles stepped out of the car, opened the rear passenger door, and stood beside it with his cap level and his hands clasped at his front. Dewey walked past him without looking up from his phone. He said nothing. He did not say good morning. He did not say anything at all. He folded himself into the back seat the way a man folds himself into furniture, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, and Miles closed the door behind him, walked around to the driver's side, and pulled smoothly out of the gate. This was not rudeness exactly. Miles had decided that a long time ago. It was simply the particular blindness that grew in men who had been powerful for long enough. The world had arranged itself around Dewey Smith's needs for so many years that the people doing the arranging had simply become part of the architecture. You didn't thank the elevator, you didn't greet the thermostat. You stepped inside, pressed the button, and went where you were going. Miles had learned to find a certain peace in it. He was good at his work. He was precise and reliable, and he knew this city the way a pianist knows a keyboard, not by thinking, but by feel. That was enough. It had always been enough. Through the privacy glass, he could hear the muffled rhythm of Dewey's morning calls. Numbers, mostly. Percentages. The language of a man for whom every conversation was, at its core, a transaction. Miles kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2. Gerald had mentioned once in passing that Dewey's breakfast that morning, the truffle eggs, the imported smoked salmon, the single glass of fresh-pressed juice flown in from a farm in California, had run just over $200. Miles's daily wage after taxes was $184. He had not brought lunch today. He hadn't brought lunch in 2 months. The copay on his heart medication had gone up in November, and something had to give, and lunch was the easiest thing to let go of quietly without anyone noticing. Nobody noticed. The afternoon run had gone long. What was supposed to be a 40-minute transfer from the downtown offices to the Hargrove meeting on the north side had stretched into something else entirely. A detour for a last-minute document pickup, a 45-minute wait outside a building while Dewey took a call that apparently could not be taken inside. And then a second stop Miles hadn't been told about until they were already 20 minutes past it. By the time he pulled the car back through the estate gates, the clock on the dash read 6:41 p.m. 12 hours and 9 minutes since he had left his apartment that morning. He sat for a moment after cutting the engine. Just a moment. His hands rested in his lap and he looked at them without meaning to. The slight tremor in the left one that had started about 6 weeks ago and that he had decided firmly and finally not to think about. It wasn't bad. It was barely anything. A faint vibration, like a phone on silent. He pressed his left hand flat against his thigh and held it there until it settled. Then he got out of the car and followed Dewey inside to collect the evening schedule from Claire. Claire had already left for the day. The schedule was on the hall table, printed and paper-clipped the way she always left it. No evening runs. He was done. He should have gone straight back to the car. That was the sensible thing. That was what he would normally do. Collect the schedule, note the morning time, and go home to the apartment and the 4 walls and the pill organizer waiting on the bathroom sink. But Gerald had left the kitchen light on, and Miles was passing the door, and he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was empty and very clean, the way Gerald always left it. Every surface wiped, every tool returned to its place, the kind of order that was its own form of pride. On the far counter, beside the waste bin, sat a small collection of items Gerald had set aside at the end of service. This was a thing Miles had noticed before but never commented on. The food that couldn't be carried over, the portions that exceeded the day's needs, the items that would be gone by morning regardless. A container of soup, half a wheel of good cheese in its wrapper, and a sandwich sealed inside a clear Ziploc bag, a small piece of masking tape on the front with the word waste written in Gerald's neat block letters. Miles stood in the doorway for a long moment. The sandwich was thick, whole-grain bread from the look of it. Some kind of meat, lettuce, the corner of a tomato visible through the plastic. Gerald didn't make bad sandwiches. Gerald didn't make bad anything. His left hand trembled once against his side. He hadn't planned it. That was the truth of it, and it mattered to him in the private ledger where he kept account of the man he was. He had not come into the kitchen with any intention. He had simply stopped in a lit doorway because he was tired and hungry and 67 years old and his body was doing things he didn't have good answers for. And there on the counter was a sandwich that was already written off, already finished, already on its way to becoming nothing. He crossed the kitchen. He picked it up. He held it for just a second, feeling the slight give of the bread through the plastic. Not for now. He wasn't hungry enough right now. Or maybe he was too tired to be hungry, which was its own kind of hunger. For tonight, he would eat it tonight, at the small table by his window, after the pills, after he'd sat for a while in the quiet. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, turned off the kitchen light the way Gerald had apparently forgotten to, and walked back out to the car. He drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the city moving past the windows like a thing that belonged to other people. The flag came through at 8:17 the following morning. Miles had already been at the estate for 20 minutes by then, the car idling in its usual spot, the heat running low. He had slept badly. The pressure in his chest had been worse in the night, a sullen, insistent weight that hadn't lifted until sometime past 3. But he had dressed carefully regardless, as he always did, and he had arrived at 7:55 as he always did, and he was sitting behind the wheel with his hands in his lap waiting for the front door to open. He did not know about the flag. He did not know about the camera mounted above the kitchen doorway that Gerald had mentioned to no one in particular when it was installed last spring. He did not know that the estate's security system automatically logged any after-hours movement in the service areas. or that those logs were reviewed each morning by a man named Patterson in the security office who took his work very seriously and had, in 4 years of employment, never once failed to file a report. He did not know any of this. He was simply sitting in the car, waiting, the way he always did. Inside, Dewey Smith reviewed the clip in his home office with a cup of coffee in one hand and his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. It ran 47 seconds. He watched it once, set down his coffee, and watched it again. In the footage, the kitchen was gray and still in the after-hours light. A figure entered from the hallway door. Tall, unhurried, recognizable even in the poor resolution by the particular set of his shoulders and the way he moved through a room as though he had a right to be quiet in it. The figure stopped at the counter, stood there a moment, then reached out, picked up the sandwich in its clear bag, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. 47 seconds. Dewey closed the laptop. He did not deliberate. This was not a man who deliberated on matters he considered already settled, and theft, in Dewey Smith's personal code, was among the most settled matters there was. Not because of the value. He understood that the sandwich was worth nothing, that it had been logged as waste, that Gerald would not have missed it. That was entirely beside the point. The point was the principle. The point was that a line existed, and the line had been crossed, and a line that was not enforced was not a line at all. It was just a suggestion, and Dewey Smith did not run his life on suggestions. He sent a single message to Claire: "Send Miles in when he arrives." Miles came through the front door at 8:22. He had been summoned this way before. Occasionally, there were schedule changes, last-minute additions to the day, things that needed to be communicated in person. He walked through the main hall the way he always walked through it, cap in hand now out of long habit, his footsteps quiet on the marble floor. He had carried luggage through this hall. He had held this door open in every season. He had stood in this exact corridor and waited more times than he could count, with the particular patient stillness of a man who had made a life out of being ready. Dewey was standing near the window when Miles entered. He did not offer a seat. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was the same one he wore in board meetings when a number came in below projection. Not angry, exactly. Resolved, he said. "The security system flagged the kitchen camera from last evening," he said. "I've reviewed the footage," he said. "I think you know what I saw." Miles said nothing. Dewey said, "I don't employ thieves. Collect your things. Today is your last day." 11 words. 12, if you counted the contraction as 2. Miles stood still for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. He looked at Dewey Smith. Really looked at him, the way he almost never allowed himself to. And something moved quietly behind his eyes. Not anger, not appeal. Something older and more tired than either of those things. Then he reached up, took his cap from under his arm, and placed it on the hall table beside him. Slowly. With great care, as though it were something worth treating gently. He turned and walked back through the hall, past the door he had held open in every season, past the marble floor his footsteps had learned by heart, out through the front entrance into the pale morning air, where the car sat idling in its usual spot with the heat still running because he had not known, when he left it, that he would not be coming back. He did not look back. He simply walked, the way a man walks when he has survived enough hard things to know that surviving is its own kind of answer. Dewey Smith had made difficult decisions before breakfast on more mornings than he could count. Terminations, contract dissolutions, the quiet restructuring of departments that left 15 people clearing their desks by noon. He was not a man who carried these things with him into the rest of his day. That was not coldness, or so he had always told himself. That was discipline. That was what it meant to operate at the level he operated at. You made the call that needed to be made, and then you moved forward, because forward was the only direction that produced results. He moved forward. He had 3 calls before 10, a working lunch with the Hargrove team, and a late afternoon review of the quarterly projections that ran 40 minutes over. He did all of it cleanly, efficiently, without once thinking about the hall table and the cap that had been left on it. Or so he told himself. The car arrived at 8:54, 9 minutes late. The driver the agency sent was a younger man, mid-30s, eager in the particular way of someone who understood the importance of the account but not the specifics of it. He had the route pulled up on his phone, visible on the dash mount, which meant he didn't actually know the route. He took the expressway to the Hargrove lunch, which added 11 minutes and deposited them at the wrong entrance, and Dewey sat in the back and said nothing, and looked out the window and did not think about the fact that Miles had never once used a phone mount. The coffee at the lunch was fine. The coffee Claire brought him at 3 o'clock was not. She had made it the way she made it for everyone, which was to say correctly by any reasonable standard. But it sat wrong somehow, a half-degree too cool, a fraction too light, and Dewey found himself looking at the cup for a moment longer than the cup warranted before setting it aside and returning to the projections. Miles had known how he took his coffee without ever being told twice. This was not a thought Dewey allowed himself to finish. He returned to the projections. The afternoon drive back from the Hargrove offices was quiet in the way that the morning drive had not been. A different quality of quiet, he noticed, though he could not immediately explain the difference. The new driver asked twice for confirmation on the route. Miles had never asked. Miles had simply known, the way certain people come to know the things that matter to the people they serve through attention so consistent it eventually becomes invisible. Dewey looked out the window and watched the city pass and did not think about this. Claire knocked at 5:40. She came in to leave the next day's schedule on the corner of his desk, the way she always did, and she was almost back through the door when she stopped. He had the sense, the way you sometimes do with people you've worked alongside for years, that she had planned this, the pause, the half-turn, the tone of careful neutrality. She said, "Miles has worked here 6 years. Did you ever learn his last name?" She did not wait for an answer. She pulled the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click that somehow carried more weight than a slam would have. Dewey sat very still. The office held 38 degrees of quiet around him. The projections were open on the screen. The coffee Claire had made was cold now in its cup on the corner of his desk. He did not know Miles's last name. He sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you didn't expect to find in your shoe, small and not supposed to be there and somehow impossible to ignore. He stayed in the office until 6:40. This was not unusual. He often worked past dark, but the quality of the staying was different tonight. He was not productive in the way he was normally productive. He moved between documents without settling into any of them. He opened his email, replied to 2 things, and then sat looking at the screen without reading it. Claire's question had lodged itself somewhere it had no business being. At 6:41, he closed the laptop and went to the filing cabinet behind the door, the physical one, the old habit he'd never fully digitized. And he found the personnel folder for current household and transport staff, and he pulled it and carried it back to the desk. Miles Arthur Copper. Date of hire, March 14th, 6 years ago. Emergency contact, none listed. He had left that field blank on his intake form, and no one had apparently followed up to ask why. Date of birth made him 67. Dewey had not known this either. He had estimated early 60s, in the vague way you estimate the age of furniture or trees, not carefully, simply as a rough orientation to what you're dealing with. The address was on Selburne Avenue. Dewey stared at it for a moment. He knew Selburne Avenue the way he knew many things about this city, abstractly, from altitude, the way you know a place when you have only ever flown over it. It was on the far east side, past the rail yard, in a district that did not appear on the mental map of the city that people like Dewey actually navigated. It was not dangerous exactly. It was simply one of those parts of a city that exists in a kind of permanent economic dusk, neither declining nor recovering, just enduring. He put on his coat and picked up his keys. He could not have explained, if asked, what exactly he was doing or why. He was not a man who made decisions he couldn't articulate. But something about the evening, the late coffee, the phone mount on the dash, the blank emergency contact field, the question Claire had not waited to have answered, had produced in him a restlessness that his usual mechanisms were not resolving. He needed to move. He needed, for reasons that remained stubbornly unclear, to see something. He drove himself. It had been 3 years, possibly 4, since he had driven himself anywhere that was not a parking structure or a private road. The city felt different from the driver's seat. Closer, less managed, the traffic lights more immediate, the other cars less theoretical. The GPS took him east along the commercial corridor and then south and then east again, past the rail yard where the floodlights threw hard shadows across stacked containers, and then into streets that narrowed slightly and grew quieter and less maintained. He drove slowly, slower than he needed to. He saw the tangled utility lines overhead, the way they looped between poles and curves that suggested years of additions and repairs rather than any original plan. He saw a laundromat still open, its windows fogged from within, a corner store with a hand-lettered sign, a bus stop with 3 people waiting in coats that were doing their best against the cold. He found the building on Selburn without needing the GPS to announce it. It was a 6-story walk-up in a dirty cream brick that had once perhaps been something closer to white. Several windows on the upper floors were dark. The front stoop had a rusted iron railing that someone had at some point attempted to repaint, and the attempt had been earnest, but unfinished. Dewey pulled to the curb and sat with the engine running and looked at it. The building looked like it had been apologizing for its existence for 30 years, apologizing quietly, without complaint, to no one in particular, simply out of habit. He turned off the engine. He did not immediately get out. He sat in the sudden silence and looked up at the lit windows on the 3rd floor and felt, for the first time in longer than he could measure, that he was not entirely sure what kind of man he was. The lobby door was unlocked. This did not surprise him. It was the kind of building where the lock had likely been broken long enough that fixing it had stopped occurring to anyone. He stepped inside and stood for a moment in the narrow entryway. A row of metal mailboxes on the left wall, most of them labeled in different hands, different inks accumulated over years. A single overhead bulb. The smell of cooked food and old carpet, and something faintly medicinal that he could not identify, and that settled uneasily in the back of his throat. He found the stairwell and climbed to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim and low-ceilinged, the carpet runner down its center worn to a pale thread in the middle where feet had traveled it longest. He moved slowly, reading the numbers on the doors. 304, 306, 308. He stopped outside 310. He had raised his hand to knock when he heard the voice and lowered it again. It was Miles's voice coming through the door with the particular clarity that thin walls and quiet buildings allow. Not loud, not meant to carry, simply audible in the way that private things become audible when the world around them is still enough. The voice was slower than Dewey remembered it, measured in a different way. Not the careful neutrality of a man managing his professional distance, but something older and less constructed. The voice of a man talking to someone he trusted completely. There was a second voice, a woman's, higher and soft, with the slightly deliberate diction of someone older. A neighbor, Dewey understood. Someone who had come to sit with him. He stood in the hallway and did not knock and did not leave. He heard Miles describe the morning, the drive out to the estate, the way the sky had looked coming over the rail yard before dawn. Something about a hawk he had seen on a telephone wire that had struck him as worth mentioning. His voice carried no self-pity, no edge of grievance. He spoke about his morning the way you speak about a morning when you are simply accounting for where you have been to someone who wanted to know. Dewey heard the woman ask something. Her voice was too soft to carry the words clearly, but he heard the register of the question, the gentle, particular way of asking about something small and specific. And then he heard Miles laugh. It was a quiet laugh, short, a little rough at the edges, the laugh of a man whose lungs were not currently at their best. But it was genuine in a way that Dewey had not heard from anyone in longer than he could immediately account for. Not performed, not social. Simply the real sound of something striking a man as slightly, genuinely funny. Miles said, "The sandwich." He said he still had it. Said he'd been saving it for morning because his stomach had been unsettled in the evening and he hadn't wanted to waste it by eating it wrong. A pause, then, "It's a good sandwich. Gerald makes a good sandwich." Didn't want to waste it. The woman said something that made Miles laugh again, softer this time, and underneath all of it, steady and unhurried, Dewey heard a sound he had not registered at first. A low, mechanical hum coming from inside the room, rhythmic, patient. The sound of a machine doing the quiet, unglamorous work of helping a man breathe. Dewey lowered his hand to his side. He stood in the dim hallway outside apartment 310, and he did not move, and he did not knock, and the hum continued its steady, indifferent work through the wall, and something in his chest, something he had spent the better part of his adult life insulating and organizing and never directly examining, began, very quietly, to come undone. He knocked twice, not loudly. The knock of a man who is no longer certain he has the right. There was a pause inside the room, a brief suspended silence in which the oxygen concentrator continued its steady hum, and nothing else moved. Then the woman's voice, closer to the door now, asking who was there. Dewey said his name. He said it the way you say a word you are suddenly not sure means what you thought it meant. Another pause. Longer. The door opened and the neighbor woman stood in it, small and round-faced, 70s perhaps, wearing a cardigan buttoned to the collar and looking at him with the direct, unhurried appraisal of someone who had lived long enough to be unimpressed by a good coat. She looked at him for a moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider without a word, as though she had decided something about him and was reserving the right to revise it later. He stepped inside. The room was small. This was the first thing, not a judgment, simply a fact that the room itself stated plainly. A single window on the far wall let in the amber light from the street below. A chest of drawers, a small table with 2 chairs, a hot plate on the counter beside the sink, and above it a shelf with a modest arrangement of canned goods organized by size. Everything in the room was worn and everything in the room was clean, and the combination of these 2 things hit Dewey somewhere below his prepared defenses before he had time to raise them. Miles was in the bed. He was propped against the headboard with a pillow behind him and a thin blanket across his lap, and there was a clear nasal cannula running from the concentrator on the floor to a point just below his nose, and he was looking at Dewey with an expression that moved through 3 distinct phases in the space of a few seconds. First confusion, the brow slightly furrowed, the eyes trying to make the information fit. Then caution, a careful rearrangement, the instinctive composure of a man who has spent years managing his presentation before powerful people. And then, beneath both of those, something that was neither, a stillness so complete it was almost its own statement. He did not speak. He simply looked. Dewey looked back. And he saw the pill bottles on the nightstand, 7 of them, arranged in a short row with the precision of a man who had learned that order was a form of control when other forms were no longer available to him. He saw the driving uniform, pressed, immaculate, hanging on a single nail beside the window, the white gloves folded over the jacket's breast pocket. He saw, beside the pill bottles, the Ziploc bag from Gerald's kitchen. The sandwich was still inside it, untouched, sitting on the nightstand in the amber light with the small piece of masking tape still visible on the front. Waste. Dewey stood in the center of the small clean room and looked at the sandwich and looked at the pill bottles and looked at the uniform hanging on its nail, and something happened in his chest that he had no practiced response for. Some structure he had constructed very young and reinforced across decades, some internal architecture he had believed without ever directly examining the belief to be permanent. Shifted, not collapsed, shifted. In the moment before it decides what it is going to do next, he sat down on the edge of the wooden chair beside the door. It creaked beneath him. He sat there for a moment looking at his own hands open in his lap, and then he covered his face. He did not make a sound. That was the thing, not a sound. Just a man in a good coat sitting on a small chair in a room that had shown him something he could not unsee, with his face in his hands and his shoulders bent forward, and 6 years of not asking a single question pressing down on him all at once like a debt come finally, irrevocably due. The oxygen concentrator hummed. The city moved softly outside the window, and Miles Copper, from the bed, said nothing. He simply waited, the way he had always waited, with a patience that had never once been earned or acknowledged or repaid, until now. Dewey did not stay long that night. He did not make promises in the room. He had sense enough to know that promises made in the acute moment of one's own shame carry a particular kind of unreliability. He stayed long enough to say what needed to be said, which was not very much. He told Miles he would be in touch. He said it quietly, without the executive cadence he used for statements he expected to be acted upon immediately. He said it the way you say something when you are not performing a decision but simply reporting one you have already made in some place below language. Miles looked at him, nodded once. Dewey shook the neighbor woman's hand at the door. He walked down the worn carpet of the third-floor hallway, down the stairwell, through the lobby with its broken lock and its accumulated mailboxes, and out into the cold air of Selburne Avenue, where his car sat at the curb exactly as he'd left it. He drove home in silence. He called Claire at 7 the following morning and asked her to find him the best cardiac specialist in the city, not well-regarded, not reputable, the best, and to have a recommendation on his desk before noon. Claire said she would. She did not ask why. She had worked for him long enough to know that the questions worth asking were not always the ones that presented themselves first. He reviewed Miles's personnel file again that morning and found the name of the medical insurance provider and spent 45 minutes on the phone, navigating the kind of automated system that was clearly designed to outlast the patience of anyone trying to use it. He outlasted it. By 10:30, he had reached someone with authority, and by 11 he had a clear accounting of Miles's outstanding medical debt, the unpaid specialist visits, the prescription backlog, the 2 occasions in the past year when Miles had requested payment plans for bills that should, had his coverage been properly structured, have cost him nothing at all. Dewey looked at the total for a long moment. Then he wrote a check and did not look at the amount again. He had Claire draw up a revised employment contract over the following week. Part-time hours, with scheduling built around medical appointments and rest requirements, full benefits, backdated to correct a coverage gap that should never have existed. A salary adjustment that reflected, with some fidelity, what 6 years of reliable, skilled, uncomplaining service was actually worth. He reviewed the document twice, made 2 small changes, and signed it. He did not call it a gesture. He did not call it charity. He told Claire to present it to Miles as a correction, a structural correction to an arrangement that had not, upon review, been accurately calibrated. Claire looked at him when he said this and did not look away immediately, which was her way of communicating something she was choosing not to put into words. He received the communication. He said nothing further. Miles returned on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks and 1 day after he had left his cap on the hall table, and walked out through the front door for what he had believed was the last time. He was behind the wheel at 7:55. The car was where it always was. The engine was running, the heat was on low, and the white gloves were folded on the dash. Dewey came through the front door at 8 o'clock. He was carrying 2 coffees in paper cups from the kitchen. Gerald had watched him take them with an expression of careful neutrality that communicated a great deal. He walked to the car, opened the rear door, placed 1 coffee on the back seat, and then walked around to the passenger window and knocked once on the glass. Miles lowered the window. Dewey held out the second cup without a word. Miles looked at it. Then he took it with the large, steady hands that had held this car on the road through every kind of weather and traffic and unreasonable hour for 6 years. He said nothing. Dewey said nothing. That was enough. It was, in the language they had always shared, the language of presence and punctuality and showing up, more than enough. 3 months is not a long time. It is long enough, however, for certain things to quietly rearrange themselves. The cardiac specialist, a precise, unhurried woman named Dr. Osei, who came with the kind of reputation that is built on outcomes rather than bedside manner, had delivered her assessment in early January with the same directness she apparently applied to everything. The damage to Miles's heart was structural and permanent. There would be no reversal, no procedure that returned things to what they had been. What there was, she said, was management. Careful, consistent management. The right medication at the right dosage, monitored regularly, combined with reduced physical strain and the elimination, as much as possible, of the kind of prolonged stress that a failing heart could no longer absorb the way a healthy one could. Miles had listened to this with the same expression he brought to most difficult information. Attentive, still, neither resisting it nor dramatizing it. He had asked 2 practical questions. He had thanked her for her time. He had driven home, within the new part-time hours, within the new arrangement. And the next morning he had been at the estate at 7:55. This was who Miles Copper was. Dewey was beginning, slowly, to understand the full dimensions of that. It was a Wednesday in late March when it happened. The city was attempting spring, tentatively, the way it always did, with cold mornings that occasionally relented into something almost warm by afternoon. They were on the long route back from a downtown meeting, the one that ran along the river for a stretch before cutting north, and Dewey was sitting in the back with the folder from the meeting closed in his lap, and the window down a few inches, and the city moving past in the pale afternoon light. He had been thinking, without intending to, about something Miles had mentioned to the neighbor woman through the apartment door that night. The hawk on the telephone wire. The detail had stayed with him without his permission, returning occasionally in the way that specific images do when they are attached to moments that rearrange something in you. He looked at the back of Miles's head, the silver hair, the straight, careful posture. He said, "Miles, where are you from originally?" He heard the slight adjustment in the car. Not the wheel, not the speed, simply the subtle shift of a man recalibrating to an unexpected thing. There was a brief pause, and then Miles told him. He was from a small city 4 states south, a place with a particular river and a particular kind of summer heat and a high school football team that had won the state championship the year Miles was 17, and that Miles had watched from the stands because he had been working after school and couldn't make the practices. He talked about his mother, who had taught elementary school for 31 years and had opinions about everything and had been, by every account including Miles's own, almost certainly the most stubborn person ever to have lived in that particular city. He talked about Evelyn. He talked about the early years of driving, the overnight freight runs, the way certain highways looked at 4 in the morning when you were the only vehicle on them, and the world felt simplified in a way that was its own kind of relief. He talked for 20 minutes. Dewey did not check his phone. He did not look at the folder in his lap. He sat and he listened in the way that he had not listened to another person in longer than he was comfortable estimating, without agenda, without the parallel processing of his own response, simply present to what was being said by the man saying it. The river came and went outside the window. The city moved past in the pale light. The heart damage was permanent. The prognosis was careful. There would be hard months ahead, medication adjustments, monitoring, the ongoing and unglamorous work of managing a body that required more attention than it used to. These were facts, and they remained facts, and neither man was confused about them. But Miles Copper was no longer invisible, and Dewey Smith was no longer the man who had watched 47 seconds of footage and believed he had seen everything there was to see. Through the windshield, the city spread out ahead of them, the same streets, the same lights, the same river catching the afternoon sun the way it always had. It looked different from back here now. It looked like a place that contained, on a street called Selburne Avenue, a building that had endured quietly for 30 years. A room with pill bottles arranged in a row, a uniform hanging on a nail, a man who had shown up 1,412 times without once being asked how he was. It looked, in other words, like a place full of people who had been there all along. Dewey looked out the window and said nothing, and let the city be what it was. And in the front seat Miles drove, steady and unhurried and present, through the afternoon light, toward wherever they were going next.